The year was 104 BC, and Rome was tired. Tired from years of foreign campaigns, tired from dragging the weight of a republic that stretched farther than its armies could march, tired from fighting wars it didn't yet understand how to win. The Cimbri were tearing across the north like a thunderstorm, swallowing Roman legions in battles too brutal to forget. In Africa, Jugurtha had turned Numidia into a war without end. And the man tasked with cleaning it all up, Gaius Marius, stood at the center of a republic that was slowly realizing it didn't have enough men to fight its battles. Rome needed soldiers. But Rome's strict citizen requirements meant the legions were no longer filling fast enough. The Senate passed a decree that offered a bold solution: slaves taken from Rome's Italian allies would be freed not for mercy, but for war, so they could take up arms under the eagle standard and fill the ranks that Roman citizens no longer could. It was a political compromise, a wartime expediency, a policy made of desperation more than principle. The decree reached Sicily, a grain-rich island still scarred from the First Servile War just 30 years earlier. The man responsible for enforcing it was Publius Licinius Nerva, a young Roman official with neither the reputation nor the resolve for the storm he was about to unleash. At first, he obeyed. He opened the courts, processed a few cases, freed a few men. Word spread like wildfire. Hope bloomed in the fields and kitchens and salt mines. Slaves lined up to claim their freedom, clutching whatever names or connections they had that might prove they were Allied-born. And then it stopped. Just as quickly as it had begun, Nerva shut the courts. Pressure came down from wealthy landowners who suddenly realized their labor force was about to vanish. The same hands they had used to build their wealth were about to pick up swords, and that was something they couldn't allow. Nerva, afraid of their anger and unsure of Rome's true commitment, reversed his decision. The decree was undone. The courts were closed. The hope vanished, but the memory didn't. And it was that betrayal, that taste of freedom snatched away, that started the fire. Across the island, whispers turned into meetings, meetings into planning, planning into revolt. Not all at once, and not yet with clarity, but something had broken. Sicily, once the breadbasket of Rome, was about to become a battlefield again. But this time, the war wouldn't begin in the Senate or on a border, it would begin in the fields, in the vineyards, in the hearts of men who had once believed they were worth something more than labor and chains. It didn't begin with armies or banners or speeches, it began with a whisper, a refusal, a wound reopened by a promise that was never meant to be kept, and as the hope of freedom was snatched away by Roman hesitation, something shifted across the fields of Sicily. Not in cities or strongholds but in the hidden corners of the island where no senators looked and no laws reached, where slaves who had tasted a flicker of freedom now tasted only rage. The first revolt sparked near Syracuse and Heraclea, not with grand plans but with raw desperation, small groups of men who chose death in defiance over silence in chains, who struck down their masters, seized weapons, and disappeared into the hills to wait for others like them. Rome, still distracted by wars abroad, brushed off the violence as scattered unrest, but the hills of Sicily were waking, and those small rebellions became the beginning of something larger, something dangerous, something Rome should have seen coming. Among the rising chaos, a man named Salvius emerged, not a soldier, not a noble, but a slave with a voice, a mind, and something rarer still, a vision. He spoke like a prophet, calling on divine favor, claiming signs and omens, offering more than rebellion, offering identity, purpose, even prophecy. They called him Tryphon, a name once worn by a Seleucid king, and with it, Salvius declared not just war, but kingship. In 1 week, 6,000 slaves gathered beneath his name. Soon, he commanded 20,000, then 30. He rode with 2,000 cavalry and laid siege to Morgantina, a city that had once stood with Rome. And as the city fell, and his forces grew, Salvius didn't just fight, he ruled. He wore purple, marched with lictors, sat on a throne in Triocala, and transformed rebellion into a state. But he wasn't alone. In western Sicily, the flames spread again. Another leader rose, Athenian, a man of fire and discipline, a self-proclaimed seer who rejected chaos and gathered only those willing to train, to fight with order, to act like soldiers and not just survivors. While Salvius built a court, Athenian built an army. They moved separately, but their cause was shared, their vision aligned, not just to resist Rome, but to challenge it, to stand not as fugitives but as kings of a new order. The uprising was no longer a riot. It was a war. And in the quiet chambers of the Roman elite, where grain shipments were late and letters grew grim, the reality began to settle in. Sicily was no longer a province, it was a battlefield. And Rome, for all its pride and legions, had once again underestimated the will of the enslaved. Some rebellions die in the mud, some burn out in chaos, but the Second Servile War did something far stranger. It began to organize, to imagine itself not just as resistance, but as rulership, and under the leadership of Salvius, now calling himself Tryphon. The rebellion didn't just grow in numbers, it grew in purpose, in confidence, in identity, because what started as a slave revolt had become something closer to a revolution, and Tryphon, sitting on a throne in the stronghold of Tryocala, draped in purple robes, surrounded by guards, issuing decrees and holding court, looked less like an outlaw and more like a king who had carved his own kingdom out of desperation and defiance. The city of Morgantina had fallen, not by accident but by strategy, and the rebel army had become a machine of its own, armed, supplied, even flanked by cavalry, marching not as scattered mobs but as a force bound together by the dream of permanence. Tryocala, their capital, wasn't just a fortress, it was a message, a symbol that they weren't running, they were staying, they were defending, and they were building a state within the cracks of Rome's empire. Coins may not have been minted, but titles were given, decisions enforced, hierarchy respected, and under Tryphon, the rebels believed, truly believed, that their freedom could be more than a moment, that it could be a future. And on the other side of the island, in the west, a different kind of leadership was forming. Athenian, less regal but no less powerful, shaped his forces like a general, not a monarch. Where Tryphon offered prophecy, Athenian demanded discipline. He chose his men carefully, trained them, drilled them, rejected those who couldn't carry their weight. His was not a kingdom of dreams, it was a war camp, and with it, he launched a siege on Lilybaeum, a major Roman port, signaling not just strength but strategy, and though the siege failed, though Roman reinforcements and allied Numidian cavalry pushed him back, he survived. He regrouped. He became not just the other face of the rebellion, but the one who would carry it forward when Tryphon's time came to an end. The two men didn't march under the same banner, but together they embodied something terrifying to Rome, a rebellion that wasn't crumbling under its own weight but stabilizing, adapting, evolving into something that couldn't be crushed by just one campaign. It had leadership. It had vision. And above all, it had momentum. The rebellion was no longer a storm to outlast, it was a system to be dismantled. And as the Senate stared across the sea at an island now ruled by former slaves, they realized they weren't dealing with a riot. They were facing a rival power. By now, the Roman Senate could no longer ignore what was happening in Sicily, grain shipments were disrupted, allies were nervous, and whispers of a slave kingdom had begun to reach the ears of citizens who still believed Rome was unshakable, and so they sent Lucius Licinius Lucullus, a seasoned commander with the authority and resources to bring order to the chaos, a man expected not just to win battles but to restore Roman dominance with a swift, brutal hand. And at first, it looked like he might do just that. Lucullus wasted no time, marching his legions across the island, and when he met Tryphon's forces at Cirthea, he didn't hesitate. The battle was brutal, a clash of discipline against desperation, and though the rebels fought fiercely, it was Lucullus who stood victorious. Thousands of slaves were killed, and the surviving rebel forces pulled back, wounded but not destroyed. It should have been the beginning of the end. But instead, it became the beginning of something stranger, something Rome hadn't planned for, because Lucullus, rather than finishing the job, slowed down, pulled back, and when word came from Rome that a new general, Gaius Servilius, was being sent to replace him, Lucullus didn't react with duty. He reacted with spite. Angry at being removed from command and determined to sabotage his successor's chances, Lucullus ordered his legions to burn the siege engines, destroy supplies, and wreck anything that might have been used to continue the campaign. It was pettiness elevated to policy. The war was still burning, and the Roman response was to trip over its own pride. Servilius arrived to find an army stripped of momentum and a province no closer to peace. Meanwhile, the rebels had time to recover. Tryphon's health began to fail, but Athenian, scarred from battle, hardened by failure, rose to take his place, not with pageantry, but with purpose. He rebuilt the army, reorganized defenses, and prepared for what everyone knew was coming. Rome had the power, but Sicily was not just resisting, it was surviving. What Rome didn't understand, or refused to admit, was that this was no longer about numbers or ranks, it was about the cracks in their own system, the gaps between policy and pride, between generals and senate, between the illusion of control and the reality of chaos. Lucullus had won the battle but lost the war's momentum, and in his refusal to hand over a clean victory, he gave the rebels a chance to breathe, and in a war like this, breath was all they needed. Because for every delay, every moment of infighting, every missed opportunity, the idea of rebellion grew stronger. Not just in Sicily, but in the memory of what might be possible when the enslaved realize that the empire they fear can bleed too. By 101 BC, Rome had run out of patience and excuses. The slave rebellion in Sicily had survived too many campaigns, outlasted too many generals, and embarrassed the Republic for too many years. The grain supply was at risk, senators were angry, and the idea that a kingdom of slaves still held territory inside a Roman province was no longer tolerable. So they turned to Manius Aquilius, a consul of no great fame but with the backing of Gaius Marius and the promise of finality. This wasn't a mission to negotiate or contain, it was a mandate to crush. Aquilius crossed the sea not with hesitation but with a full consular army, hardened veterans and fresh recruits alike, and he didn't come for parley or strategy, he came for reckoning. On the other side of the island, Athenian knew what was coming. By now he had taken full control of the rebellion after the death of Salvius, and he had no illusions left about glory or survival. He gathered what was left of the rebel army, some say 30,000 strong, though fewer were trained, fewer still ready for what was ahead, and he met Aquilius in open battle. It was the final storm. There were no fortresses to fall back to, no illusions of retreat, just two armies staring across a field where only one would leave alive. The fighting was brutal, fast, and hopelessly one-sided. The Roman legions, drilled and disciplined, cut through the rebel lines with terrifying speed. Athenian himself fought fiercely, even managing to wound Aquilius in the chaos, but his strength could not save a cause already surrounded. The rebel formation collapsed, some scattered, some fought to the end, but the field was soaked with blood by the time the dust settled. Athenian was dead, the last true leader of the uprising slain on the same island where it had begun, and what remained of the rebellion was now cornered, hunted, broken. In the hills and caves of central Sicily, the last 1,000 rebels made a final stand, not by building walls or setting ambushes, but by choosing how they would die. Aquilius offered them a Roman compromise, life in exchange for a spectacle, a chance to be paraded and fed to beasts in the arena for the entertainment of the very people whose chains they had once escaped. But they refused. With no audience but themselves, they turned their swords inward, killing one another in solemn succession until only one remained, and when all the others were dead, he turned his blade on himself and ended the war in silence. No applause. No mercy. Just defiance carried to its last breath. It was over. The Second Servile War had ended not in surrender but in self-destruction, not in negotiation but in fire and memory. Rome had retaken Sicily, but not without cost, not without leaving behind a trail of stories that could not be buried with the bodies. And somewhere in the back rooms of the Republic, in the corners where future slaves listened and remembered, the names Salvius and Athenian lingered, not as kings, but as proof that for a time, brief and bloody, the enslaved had dared to rule. There's something haunting about the way the Second Servile War ended, not with drums or declarations, not with generals standing over defeated kings, but in a quiet place, high in the hills of Sicily, where the last 1,000 rebels, tired, hunted, forgotten, chose to meet death on their own terms rather than serve as trophies in someone else's parade, because when the offer came from Manius Aquilius, dressed in the familiar Roman diplomacy of brutality disguised as mercy, life in exchange for submission, for the entertainment of others, to be dragged in chains and thrown to beasts before cheering crowds in the amphitheaters of Rome, they didn't hesitate, they didn't bargain, they simply turned inward, toward each other, toward the only freedom they had left, and one by one, with no fanfare and no witness, they ended it themselves. Not out of desperation, but out of something older and deeper, a defiance so final that even Rome had no answer for it. They had fought as slaves, marched as rebels, crowned kings from the fields, and now, in the last moment, they chose to fall as free men. It's easy to dismiss their story as failure, to look at the ashes of Triocala or the blood-soaked hills and see only defeat, but history isn't written only by victors, it's shaped by the ones who refused to accept the world as it was, who, even in losing, exposed the cracks in the empire that claimed to be eternal. Rome won, yes, but it was shaken. Twice in one generation, its own provinces had erupted in rebellion, not from foreign invaders, but from the people it owned, people who had no weapons, no citizenship, no place in the official story, until they forced themselves into it with stolen swords and makeshift crowns. And in the silence after the war, in the empty fields where rebellion once stood, something else remained, the memory, the echo, the knowledge that beneath Rome's marble surface was a system built on the backs of people who would not forget, who would tell their children, who would remember the names Salvius and Athenian not as madmen, but as men who tried. Rome had crushed a rebellion, but it hadn't killed the question it left behind: what happens when the ones at the bottom realize they have nothing left to lose and everything to gain by rising? That question would not go away. It would linger, ferment, grow louder in whispers passed between shackled hands and broken voices, until one day, decades later, another man would pick up a weapon in the name of that same question, and this time, his name would be Spartacus. The Second Servile War was over, its leaders dead, its followers buried or erased, its cities burned and reclaimed by the empire they had once defied, and yet, in the stillness that followed, in the silence Rome mistook for peace, something remained. Not armies, not banners, but memory. A quiet memory rooted in defiance, a reminder whispered in fields and kitchens and barracks that for a brief, impossible moment, the forgotten had risen, the voiceless had spoken, and the enslaved had worn crowns. Rome would move on, as empires always do, shifting its focus back to its northern wars and eastern ambitions, rebuilding its grain routes and restoring the illusion of order in Sicily, but the truth was that a crack had opened, small and jagged but real. And deep within the machinery of the Republic, that crack would begin to widen, not from foreign invasion or natural disaster, but from within, from the weight of the very system that made these uprisings inevitable. The slaves who fought under Salvius and Athenian were gone, but their story traveled further than any legion, carried in whispers by those who cleaned Roman floors, served Roman meals, and fought in Roman arenas, and among them, one name began to gather meaning not just as a man but as a possibility: Spartacus. He hadn't been there in Sicily. He hadn't marched through Morgantina or stood beside Athenian at the last battle, but he had surely heard the stories, maybe from fellow gladiators, maybe from aging slaves who still remembered what it felt like to believe they might be free. And when his moment came, decades later, it came with a fire not unlike the one that burned through Sicily, a fire born not from strategy but from desperation, not from prophecy but from raw, human refusal to live one more day in chains. And when that fire lit Italy itself, Rome realized too late that it had seen this before. The rebellion of Spartacus was larger, louder, more terrifying because it happened on the Italian mainland, but it was not the first. It was the child of what came before, the final echo of a question that still demanded an answer: how long can a world built on exploitation survive before the exploited decide to fight back? The Second Servile War didn't change Rome, not right away, but it warned it, it challenged it, it exposed the limits of fear and the brittleness of power when stretched too thin over people who refused to be forgotten. And in remembering that story, not just as a failed rebellion but as a human struggle to reclaim dignity, we remember what empires often try to erase, that even the most absolute systems crack when their foundations are built on silence. And even the most voiceless people find their power when they dare to speak with fire. The war ended in blood, but the idea did not. The seeds had been planted, and when the time was right, they would burn brighter than ever.